This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. I'm Randall Burkett. I'm the curator of African American collections in the Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library here at Emory, and delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Graduate Institute of the Liberal Arts, the Department of African American Studies, and the library, who together are co-sponsoring our symposium this afternoon on race and sports in American culture. The occasion marks two significant developments in African American collections in our rare book and manuscript library, which the first of which is we're opening a new collecting area in MARBL related to African Americans in sports. We think it is a critically important subject for scholarly research and understanding, to understand the relationship between sports and society, and sports and the intersection of race and gender issues as they intersect with sports and society. And the first collection that we acquired, and the collection that helped spur our interest in collecting in this area, are the papers of Clyde Parton Sr., much beloved figure at Emory for many years, who recently passed, and his widow and the family decided to donate the many of the manuscripts, correspondence, some of the memorabilia, books from the library that he'd assembled over a lifetime of interest in the world of sports. And we have a few cases. At the end of the session, we invite you to browse around. He had a wonderful collection of Hall of Fame signed baseballs, other baseballs, team balls. There are materials from his collection, but also some samples from a range of other materials that we've gathered in the course of building African American collections. The second important development that we're marking is the appointment of Pellom McDaniels as curator for this area of collecting. He's also going to be working in the area of civil rights and others with me. Pellom is a well-known, I'm sure he's better known to many of you than I am to you. He is the most known factor on this campus. It never takes less than 20 minutes to walk across the campus, because people just seem to come out of the doors, the windows. They come to say hello, give greetings. So we're welcoming Pellom back. He completed his PhD in ILA in 2007. His dissertation was Angles of Ascent: Race, Class, Sport, and Representation in African American Masculinity. He was a star athlete at Oregon State University. He was a professional, had a professional career with the NFL. He was also a star academic scholar at Emory, where he is now making his name in the academic world with his research and teaching and writing. And he is working as a consultant with us to develop this area. He's continuing his appointment as assistant professor of history at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So we are delighted, Pellom, to have you a part of the MARBL team. And I will say that the program this afternoon is the first of a series of programs that we anticipate he will be developing in relation to the collections that we're acquiring. The public scholarship dimension of the materials that we acquire in MARBL is a very important dimension of gathering. We don't just want to gather the materials and put them up on a shelf. We want you to use the materials, and we want to develop public programs that enable you to interact with folk who have done research in the area related to our collections. I will say he has a collaborator in the development of this program. Dana White, recently retired professor of American Studies in the ILA, has recently been received on waivers from ILA to MARBL And he is going to be working with us to help build collections and develop programs. We feel very strongly that it's critical to have a solid scholarly and academic underpinning to the materials that we're collecting to enable the analysis and better understanding of sport in American society. He has taught regularly courses on baseball and American culture here, but we have a range of faculty across the university who are interested in this area. Carol Anderson in African American Studies, Jeffrey Lesser in the History Department, William Gruber in English, who has team taught a course with Dana White, Clyde Parton at the medical school. Clyde Parton Jr. has been very interested. So with this deep faculty interest and our growing student research interest in this area, we felt it is important for us to reflect those interests in our collecting, and we're delighted to be able to open this new area of collecting for MARBL. With that, I will turn the program over to Pellom McDaniels, who will introduce the panel and moderate, followed by there will be conversation. We'll have some refreshment, have an opportunity for you to look at the exhibition. So thank you very much for coming. Pellom?
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We are delighted to have you.
As always, it's a pleasure to come back to Atlanta, especially to Emory, where I did my work and spent a lot of time and have made a lot of friends and colleagues, and really enjoy coming back home, is what I like to say sometimes. But before we begin, I have to do what is always need to be done when you're doing these types of events. You need to thank the people who actually made it possible. First and foremost, I want to thank Randall Burkett for recruiting me, drafting me onto another project that guarantees to be not just a whirlwind, but something that's going to be exciting for everyone who's involved. I don't know if you all remember this, but back in 2006, we participated together along with Tiffany Gleason, another graduate student, on the curation of the Carter G. Woodson collection, which also produced an exhibit, catalog, and it actually traveled for about a year across the country, especially it came to Kansas City, which is away from Atlanta, so we can say across the country. But that was an exciting time for me. I was completing my dissertation and having an opportunity to work directly with Randall and Special Collections. Also like to thank Dr. White. Dr. Dana White, colleague now, has been keeping people in line as I travel between Kansas City and Atlanta. He's been the eyes and ears and hands and feet in working with Mashadi and Special Collections, gathering everything to present for today, so you all would have a chance to see what's in the collection. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. From an administrative standpoint, we can't forget our Vice Provost and Director of Libraries, Rick Luce, and also Interim Director Ginger Kane, for their support of this endeavor and really meeting with me one-on-one on different occasions to talk about the future of what we would like to do at Emory as it relates to Special Collections and African Americans in the collection. Randall had alluded to this idea that we want to expand on what we do, and part of that is producing products that come out of our research, things that will travel. We're talking about digital collections, but also digital exhibitions. We're talking about curriculum, all the things that you can produce from these collections and exhibitions that we have to start thinking about, that will not only give us a larger presence in the academic community, but will allow for our students to learn in different ways. And so these are the things that we're going to discuss over the coming months and years. I have to make one also announcement, or at least introduce someone to you who has also been a part of this. Dick and Pam Cecil are friends of not only myself, but friends of Emory. And they have taken us in, and they have a significant collection that they would like to give our university related to sports that will be a very, very important part of what we do in the future. So just to say thank you, Dick, thank you, Pam. Last but not least, I have to say how appreciative I am of the Emory community as a whole. Randall also said that when I walk across campus, people jump off the window to say hey to me. That's not always true. But it's been one of those situations where bringing new colleagues to our campus, Dr. Gerald Early and Mike Glenn, who's been here, this is something they have to experience. They have to understand that presenting here at Emory is not just something you do and you move on and hopefully you'll come back when invited. I think our students and our faculty appreciate when we have visiting scholars present their work to our community because it enriches who we are and our work. So thank you very much for coming. Okay, so as most of you know, this week the Atlanta Braves is hosting Major League Baseball's annual Civil Rights Game, and it's going to take place on Sunday against the Philadelphia Phillies. Are you a Philadelphia Phillies fan?
Somewhat.
Somewhat. Okay. As a formal introduction to the new focus in Emory University's manuscripts, archives, rare books library on African Americans in sports, Professor Dana White, Randall Burkett, and myself recognized that this week would be the most appropriate time to host a symposium to complement the activities planned around this very important game. Today's symposium is intended to examine the intersections between race and sports in American history and provide an open forum for a conversation about the challenges ahead. There are three underlying goals of this public presentation. First, to provide a space for a dialogue that addresses the impact of individuals such as Jackie Robinson and Hank Aaron, to name but a few, on American culture through their individual and collective participation in sports. Second, to interpret the impact of sports and race in sports in civil rights history. And three, to provide the space to discuss what is next beyond the traditional memorialization and commemoration, thank you, Randall, of the breaking of racial barriers in sports. That's not too difficult to say. The panelists this afternoon will speak to these questions in an attempt to help us understand the importance of collecting the papers of African American athletes and how studying their past contributions and their impact on civil and human rights issues can shed new light on the significance of sports in the development of African American social, political, and economic empowerment. Our first presenter is the director of the Center for the Humanities and the Merle Kling Professor of Modern Letters at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Gerald Early is the author and editor of numerous volumes, including Lore and Loathing, essays on race, identity, and the ambivalence of assimilation, Body Language, Writers on Sport, The Culture of Bruising, essays on prize fighting, literature, and modern American culture, which, by the way, won a 1994 National Book Critics Circle Award for criticism, and he is currently completing a book on Fisk University. In 1997, Dr. Early was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has been the recipient of several awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the General Electric Foundation. One of the most interesting things that I recently learned about him in the process of gathering this information was that he's been nominated twice for Grammy Awards. Now, both of them for writing the liner notes, correct, for albums. Gerald Early, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I thank you all for coming out, and I'd like to thank Randall Burkett and Pellom for inviting me to come talk to you today. And so I'd like to make a few remarks, and most of my remarks are about two athletes that you know very well. In any discussion about sports, their past, their present, their future, and particularly their relationship to race, I think three basic questions ought to be addressed before proceeding to any others. The first question is, what is a high-performance athlete, and what is the nature of his or her appeal to the public? The second question is, what are high-performance sports, and why do they exist? And the third is, how does race affect the answers to the first two questions? I shall offer some thoughts on all three of these questions. On the front page of the April 25th, May 1st, 2011 issue of Sports Business Journal is a story about Philadelphia Eagle quarterback Michael Vick entitled "Vick's Rehabilitation as Endorser Accelerates." We learn from the article that Vick, quote, has agreed to do a 70 to 90-minute documentary film chronicling his life with Bombo Sports and Entertainment, unquote. Bombo CEO Bob Porter promises that the film, quote, won't be a sugarcoating, but it should be a good film about an athlete who is fantastically talented and really polarizing at the same time, unquote. Readers also learn from the article that if Michael Vick wins an online fan vote, he will become the cover athlete of EA Madden's NFL 12 game. Quote, a Madden cover would get Vick back into the aisles at places like Walmart and or Toys R Us, where he was but hasn't been able to get back into, according to one senior marketing director quoted in the article. The fact that Vick made it as far as he did in the fan voting is a testament to the sustained efforts of rehabilitation of his image. The fact that he was the 2010 Comeback Player of the Year after replacing injured starting quarterback Kevin Kolb has certainly helped Vick greatly. Kolb, who had been the Eagles' #1 quarterback, was unable to get his job back when he returned from his concussion because Vick's performance was so extraordinary. As the old saying goes, nothing succeeds like success. Vick, throwing 21 touchdowns last season and running for 9 more, remains one of the most exciting players in the NFL and is, in fact, a better quarterback now than he was before his imprisonment when he was the starting quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. As things have turned out, Vick actually wound up losing the Madden game cover by a nearly 2-to-1 margin to Cleveland Browns running back Peyton Hillis. The fact that Vick lost the Madden game cover by such a wide margin indicates that there are still probably a substantial number of sports fans that are repelled by the crimes for which he went to prison. But the fact that he may, over time, especially if he continues to perform well for the Eagles, be able to overcome the stigma of being an ex-con who committed acts that were not only illegal but shamefully cruel and become again even a somewhat marketable athlete in the commercial world is a remarkable story. Or let us say it's a remarkable storyline, as the press has very much helped to shape, quote, the redemption of Michael Vick, unquote, as its narrative arc. The story about Vick in the Sports Business Journal fits this template. To refresh your memories, you may recall that in August 2007, Michael Vick pled guilty to federal felony charges of operating an unlawful dogfighting venture. What made matters worse for Vick in the eyes of federal prosecutors and in the eyes of the public is that he admitted to killing himself 6 to 8 poorly performing pit bulls by drowning or hanging. He was also complicit in the gruesome murders of many other dogs that could not make the top grade as performers. The idea that a professional athlete, himself a public performer, would treat poorly performing animals so completely under his power in such a cruel sport that he would treat them so heartlessly and ruthlessly was dismaying and enraging to many people. Thus, Vick became the demon poster child for anti-animal cruelty organizations and for various animal rights groups. Vick was sentenced to 23 months in prison, of which he served 19. After his release from prison, Vick signed with the Philadelphia Eagles in August 2009 as a backup to Donovan McNabb. It is interesting how Vick, or the people around him, engineered his return to the NFL by associating him with black men in football who had impeccable personal credentials, namely former Indianapolis Colts coach Tony Dungy, the first black head coach to win a Super Bowl, and Donovan McNabb, who had been seen as a victim of racism in 2003, if you'll recall, when conservative radio commentator Rush Limbaugh made disparaging remarks about how the press wanted McNabb to succeed because of his race. I don't know how many of you remember that, but that was a very prominent thing back in 2003. McNabb was also seen as the victim in the contretemps that erupted between him and star wide receiver Terrell Owens after the Eagles lost Super Bowl 39 in February 2005, when Owens said in effect that McNabb was not a Super Bowl caliber quarterback. With so much lurid press coverage of black NFL players being arrested for gun possession or being connected to domestic or nightclub violence or visiting stripper clubs, of the NFL being turned into a league of black thugs, there were in fact cover stories about this, if you'll recall, in Time and Newsweek and the like. Vick chose his new friends well. After all, Vic had been in trouble himself before the dogfighting conviction. In 2006, he was fined for making obscene gestures to fans in the New Orleans Superdome. In 2005, a woman sued him for giving her genital herpes without disclosing the fact to her that he had the disease, for which he was secretly getting treatment under the alias of Ron Mexico. You'll recall they started putting out jerseys with Mexico on it. The NFL had to squash that. Moreover, just 1 month after Vic signed with the Eagles and was reinstated to the NFL on July 4th, 2009, Tennessee Titan quarterback Stephen McNair was shot and killed by his mistress, who then killed herself. An unwelcome scandal for the NFL and another unfavorable story about black NFL players. Vic needed to thread a moral needle in his return, and he managed to do this up to this point. In this way, Vic has helped himself or enabled the press in fashioning his story as one of redemption, taking subtle advantage as well of the belief among the liberal educated elite about the disproportionate incarceration of black males as an institutional, political, and cultural injustice. Vic would never publicly say that he feels he was unfairly treated because he is black, or that he did not deserve the punishment he was given. But many blacks feel that a star white athlete convicted of the same charges would not have been nearly as vilified as Vic was. The difference is starkly represented in the 2007 poll conducted by YourBlackWorld.com that showed that while only 15% of whites thought race played a role in Vic's dilemma, 46% of blacks thought that race had something to do with it. In a more recent poll, 82% of blacks think Vic should be playing football, while only 42% of whites think so. The idea that a white star athlete would not have been vilified to the same extent as Vic for the same crime is, of course, pure conjecture on the part of those blacks who feel that way. But as there is evidence that black men are sometimes excessively punished in their prison sentencing, and that young black men generally have been stigmatized and even caricatured as thugs, it is understandable that many black people feel as they do about the Vic case. This underscores the fact that no great athlete is merely or only an athlete whose significance is based solely on what goes on the playing field. Athletes are also complex social, political, and cultural emblems to our society and of our society, which in some profound ways they have come to represent. Athletes are exemplars, more emotionally deep as national legends than virtually any other type of performer in popular culture. All public performers need loyalty in order to sustain themselves. They need their audiences to identify with them, to form a psychological bond. Great athletes elicit more intense loyalty because they are seen as being heroic in ways that other pop culture figures are not. What are sports? They are live dramas of highly regulated and structured competition, staged for commercial purposes that require enormous physical training and mental discipline, where the outcome is unknown and usually not predictable. Sports are live dramas performed under great stress and pressure. The outcome is victory or defeat. These are the singular elements that attract large numbers of the public to sports, and it is the ability of great athletes to perform well under pressure that makes them heroic. Can an athlete who polarizes the public be heroic? This is the question with Vic. And as the Sports Business Journal article about Vic suggests, can an athlete be commercially successful who is polarizing? It is more likely that a black athlete would be more polarizing to the that's a question. Is it more likely that a black athlete would be more polarizing to the public than a white one? Some black commentators certainly believe that, as some have pointed to the recent Q score, which named, this is polling data, marketing polling data, that named the 6 most hated athletes in America. All of them are black. For the record, if you want to know who they are, is Michael Vick, Tiger Woods, Terrell Owens, Chad Ochocinco, Kobe Bryant, and LeBron James. Active athletes. If this is true, if this polling is actually accurate, this should lead us to ask some searching questions about why the public sees black athletes differently, and if it is the function of the black athlete generally in American society to be at times a polarizing presence, an outlaw presence, a trickster figure that enhances the black athlete's entertainment value. In other words, does the black athlete as a polarizing figure actually have more entertainment value as such? And is that one of the reasons why the black athlete is made into a polarizing figure? In other words, to be polarizing does not necessarily foreclose the possibility of a black athlete having considerable financial and athletic success. Think of the careers of Muhammad Ali, or Doc Ellis, or Mike Tyson, or Ron Artis, all very polarizing figures who wound up having great financial and athletic success. This should lead to the question, if this is true about the black athlete, this true about this polarizing business, can it be changed? Should it be changed? Or does the sporting public largely, though by no means exclusively made up of whites, prefer for matters to stay as they are? Do they prefer to have some black athletes play a role of being polarizing agents in society, polarizing agents in sports? I shall return to these questions in a moment. It should be noted that Vic was twice voted the most hated athlete in America in polls taken in the last 2 years in Forbes magazine. In December 2010, in a poll of Philadelphia residents conducted by the Philadelphia Daily News, I know this is enemy territory for Philadelphia because I know the Phillies are your main rivals in baseball. I know, I understand. I grew up in Philadelphia, but don't hold that against me. Okay. In a poll in the Philadelphia Daily News, it was discovered that as the Eagles won more games under Vic, public approval of him increased. In this particular poll, 76% of Philadelphians had a positive opinion of him. The Eagles were playoff bound with Vic at quarterback when the poll was taken. Another important question is, what does it mean when a large segment of the public is shown to hate an athlete? What does it mean to hate a black athlete or an athlete of color? Isn't hate, after all, a common emotion among sports fans who love their own favorites, their own teams, and hate the opposition? It has not even always been the case that when a black athlete is hated, it is mostly whites who hate him. Give you an example of the boxer Joe Frazier. During the heyday of Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier was far more hated by blacks who thought he was an Uncle Tom than by whites. Is the hatred of a black athlete always political in some form or fashion, or does race over-politicize sports today? Perhaps we need to understand how sports hatred, that is, the hatred sports fans feel for the opposition or for rivals, how that works in relation to feelings of race, and how and in what ways it may be connected with racial hatred or racial bias. Maybe we don't understand things as well as we think we do. Does this combination of sports hatred and race intensify the thrill of being a sports fan? Or do black sports fans hate certain superior white players in the same way that some white sports fans hate certain superior black players? Give you an example. Did many black sports fans hate Larry Bird in relation to his main rival, Magic Johnson? Did many black sports fans hate Jerry Cooney in relation to his rival, Larry Holmes? Did many black sports fans hate Martina Hingis in relation to her rival, the young Venus Williams? Let us briefly consider another case of a polarizing black athlete who is currently facing prison. On April 13, 2011, former San Francisco Giant outfielder and home run king Barry Bonds was convicted in federal court of one count of obstruction of justice in his perjury trial, focusing on whether he lied to a grand jury about knowingly using performance-enhancing steroids. The jury could not reach a verdict on the 3 other charges. Steroid allegations have dogged Bonds for the last 8 or 9 years and certainly have besmirched his reputation and called into question his career accomplishments, at least any of the career accomplishments of the 5 seasons from 2000 through 2004, when everybody's pretty sure he was taking steroids, okay? Those are the years, those are the big years, those 5 years are the big years in question. The press has never liked him very much, thinking him crassly egotistical and unbearably temperamental. But his extraordinary talents were lavishly praised until the steroid allegations began to take traction. Baseball analyst Bill James once ranked him as one of the 5 best players ever to play the game. Will the press create a redemption narrative here as it has done with Vic? Will Bonds and his handlers enable the press to create such a narrative? One wonders if Manny Ramirez, the star outfielder who played most famously or infamously for the Boston Red Sox and who suddenly quit baseball in disgrace after testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs, one wonders if he will be able to become the subject of a redemption narrative. Bond's biggest hurdle in a redemption story is that he is completely ostracized from his sport. He is too old to be an active player, and no club has any interest in him working in any capacity for it. He may have no interest in being a coach or administrator, and some baseball people may think he lacks the personality to teach others or to discover talent. Many clubs are surely afraid of the reaction of their fan base if they were to make any overtures to employ Bonds in any capacity, and that probably plays a role too. Mark McGwire has at least a chance over time of redeeming himself simply because he is back in the game as the hitting coach for the St. Louis Cardinals. Being able to play has helped Michael Vick enormously with the public, as the Philadelphia Daily News poll shows. A great athlete who is also polarizing may, in fact, be grudgingly admired by people who hate him while he is still playing. The other major problem with Bonds is that he is seen as a cheater. His achievements are no longer respected because of the cloud of steroid use. Although it must be said, if you look at his record, between 2000 and 2004, the years that he used steroids, if you threw those years out, he would still make the Hall of Fame with the other years that he had. That's how good he was, that if you could throw those years out and still put him in the Hall of Fame. Vic does not have that problem of having tainted himself on the field as a performer. Charges of steroid use have never gained traction with Vic. Such is the power of sports, such is the essence of the meaning of sports, that seemingly we are more tolerant of misbehavior, even criminal behavior, by an athlete off the field, as long as he performs honorably on the field. This is precisely the issue with baseball great Pete Rose. His performance as a player has never been called into question, yet he is, like Bonds, a pariah. But the public perception of Bonds and Rose are different. Over the years, polls have shown the majority of the people are in favor of Rose being elected to the Hall of Fame and of being able to return to baseball. When Bonds was chasing Henry Aaron's career home run record, according to an ABC poll, 52% opposed his pursuit and only 37% were in favor of it. The same poll showed the majority of blacks, though, in favor of Bonds pursuing the record. It is interesting that at the time when Bonds broke the record, Aaron received a great deal of supportive press. He became an even greater sports hero than he had been before. But for many African Americans, the situation seemed as if whites were making Aaron the good Negro, and Bonds was, to use a vulgarity, the bad nigger. That praising Aaron permitted whites to cover to denigrate Bonds in their efforts to uphold the moral sanctity of baseball. Blacks had a right to be a bit suspicious of the moral fervor which with whites were suddenly defending the sanctity of sports records. I had written an op-ed piece at the time suggesting that all records in baseball before the integration of baseball, such as DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak and the like, should be marked with an asterisk to remind the public that these are in fact white records. I was roundly condemned for this piece, but I was merely trying to place sports records in their proper moral light. Has Hollywood contributed in any significant way to how we see black athletes and race in sports? Did films like the Rocky series or Hoosiers or Any Given Sunday essentially present the black athlete in a cliched and stereotyped way? Sports films usually glorify the underdog, show overcoming adversity as being heroic, and show in the end that the morally superior side prevails over the other side, which is usually seen as, bad or evil or whatever. Given this template, how often are blacks the underdog in sports movies? How often are they shown to prevail over great adversity? How often have you seen a black movie where you've seen the black athletes even training to learn their sport? I mean, I asked you that question. I tell you, it's not many. It's not many because, you know, it's not. How often are they seen as morally superior opposed to the other side? I'm not suggesting that this never happens in Hollywood movies. There is Bernie Mac and Mr. 3000 and Denzel Washington and Hurricane and Remember the Titans, which are sports films that try to present blacks a bit differently. But this is not typically the case. The fact that so many sports movies are made is a sign of how sports transcends the playing fields, how sports represent certain values that people generally can admire, how symbolic sports are for the public, even that part of the public that cares nothing for sports. There are many issues to be raised about the future of race in sports. I wish I could go on talking about the movies, but my time is running out, so I can't say anything more about the movies, but you can ask me during Q&A if you like. There are many issues to be raised about the future of race in sports. One, the use of Latino players in professional baseball and the economic relationship of the United States to baseball-producing countries in the Caribbean and Central America. You might read Rob Ruck's new book, Raceball, which is a very good book that deals with this subject. The increasing use of public monies and public space to subsidize professional sports in big cities and what this means to black taxpayers and city dwellers. The increasing pressure on sports leagues to adopt more free market practices and what this means to black athletes and blacks in general. You know, sports leagues are basically monopolies that were invented in the 19th century. I mean, they're a business structure from the 19th century. And so what's going to happen with this business structure hitting the reality of the 21st century and the increasing pressure of free market practices, which is what the NFL players' strike is partly about, is to try to get the league to adopt more free market practices. But I will return to a question I posed earlier. If it is true that the black athlete plays the role of the polarizer, can it be changed? Or does the sporting public largely, though by no means exclusively made up of whites, prefer for matters to remain as they are? Part of the answer to this lies in the fact that blacks themselves have mixed feelings about sports as an image. The fact that blacks have been successful in many areas of sports as performers, and even as coaches and managers, has been a source of pride, but blacks also feel that sports have stigmatized them and made them seem even less able to do intellectual things. Blacks are also concerned about whether the increasing riches of the star athlete serve their communities well. When Michael Jordan refused to endorse Harvey Gantt for the Senate in South Carolina in 1990 and 1996, many African Americans wished that black athletes would serve as better role models. They would serve as better role models if they were more political. I wonder if this is true. But Jordan's refusal to endorse was seen as part of a larger problem of black athletes who seem estranged from the black communities that spawned them. Have the riches of star black athletes made black communities better? Or have they simply made black children crazy for material possessions for all the wrong reasons? Can the black athlete and the black rapper, for that matter, represent anything other than material achievement? Can blacks aspire to be something more than entertainers, which is something a woman once said to me when I spoke about African Americans in sports? In the future, the black public itself must begin to articulate its own vision about sports, what it finds valuable about sports, and most importantly, what role they feel sports ought to play in the lives of their communities. This means, counterintuitively, that African Americans must, as a group, take sports far more seriously than they do now. Not as a form of entertainment or as an expression of popular culture, not for glamour and not for making heroes or millionaires, but as a cultural, political, social, and economic force in the world that is, in fact, changing the world. Sports are a form of power, and it will be good for all when this is finally fully understood. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is a former NBA basketball player and a public historian who collects rare books, newspapers, and magazines by and about African Americans. Mike Glenn shares his artifacts through traveling exhibits and lectures. From his collection, he wrote Lessons from My Library, Volume 1. Mike writes and shares the inspirations and accomplishments of past African American heroes who face obstacles of oppression, racism, bigotry, ignorance, and hate. He has written 11 biographical treatises on various African American athletes. He has skillfully paired contemporary perspectives on life and success with that of great leaders and philosophers who left us with a strong legacy of courage and mental toughness. Mike Glenn.
Thank you all very much. Very happy and pleased to be here with you. Let me first review a little bit and share with you how I kind of was born into many of these lessons and situations that I now find myself compelled to be a participant in. Okay, growing up here in Georgia in the South, where my dad had started the basketball program, the actual sports program at Georgia School for the Deaf, and coached every sport they had. At a time of segregation, he was a coach and the founder of the sports programs at Georgia School for the Deaf. He had started that a few years before I was born. And remembering back, I can remember at about the age of 5 or 6, going with my dad to some practices and never knowing fully what to expect and what all his coaching and all of that was all about. So I went with Dad in the gym at about 5 years old, and the girls on his team, these were high school deaf girls and boys that he coached, they started running up to me, and they were picking me up, and they were kissing me on the jaw. Now, you know when you're 5 years old, you just don't know how to appreciate those kisses like you can later on in your life. I started to yell, "Dad, help me! These girls are attacking me out here, and they're not even saying anything." Dad thought that was so funny, he just started to laugh. And then he explained to me, though, he said, "Mike, these girls are deaf." He says, "That means they can't hear or talk to you." He said, "But they want to be your friend." He said, "If you want to be their friend, you're going to need to learn some sign language." Now, I thought about that at 5 years old, and I decided, okay, I'll learn some sign language. Now, the girls on Dad's team just adopted me into their culture. I remember Dad had this one girl on his team. Her name was Mildred, and her last name was Nelson. She was the best player on his team. Matter of fact, Mildred's the best player in the history of Georgia School for the Deaf. Mildred was a beautiful girl. She had smooth, dark, beautiful skin. At that time, I thought she looked like a Hershey's bar. And so Mildred started teaching me things. She started teaching me my ABCs, and she started teaching me signs like daddy and mommy and home and eat and play, and a lot of different lessons on sharing and inclusion that would stay with me throughout my life. I would go to the gym and I would clap for Mildred, and she was knocking down jump shots, and Mildred was my first hero, and I just wanted to learn how to shoot that basketball like Mildred. And sometimes on the road games, I would sit on the bus and try to sit beside Mildred, and I learned just so many lessons on basketball and sharing and inclusion from deaf kids. And then Dad started teaching me other lessons. Dad started telling me about other great basketball heroes as I started to really love and appreciate and idolize other sports figures in our history. He would tell me about 3 famous people whose names all begin with J. He would tell me about Jesse Owens, and he would talk about Jackie Robinson, and then he also would talk about Joe Lewis. He would talk about sitting around and how important it was to the whole black community to just sit around that radio when Joe Lewis would fight and when he would win, how much it meant and how important it was. And I didn't have a true understanding of how great and how significant sports was overall other than those 3 guys. I knew from my conversations with my dad and my mom how important Jackie Robinson, Joe Lewis, and Jesse Owens had been to the black community and the feelings of liberation and his feelings of I am somebody. All of that was caught up into essence of their performing on a sports level. I went on through school. Both my parents are teachers, and developed a lot of appreciation for various figures throughout history. And I became a book collector, kind of traveled the same path that my good friend Randall Burkett had traveled, and collecting books and newspapers and artifacts and documents of African American history and culture, and Professor Lone's books and all of those kinds of things I collected. And then I heard this conversation one time that kind of expanded my collecting and my focus. It was a special on one of the sports networks, and they were doing a comparison. They were talking about Barry Bonds and all of the home runs and everything that he had, all of his accomplishments, and they were comparing him with Babe Ruth. And so they did an outstanding job. They analyzed everything from the live ball to the dead ball, to the right-hand pitchers to the left-hand pitchers, to every possible analysis that you could really think of. And then they came into this one particular place where they said, but Babe Ruth played in a white era. And I said, wait a minute, what did he say? He played in a white era? Surely he meant he played on a white team against only white players, but not in a white era. There's never been a white era on this planet that there were not blacks. So I said, oh man, we have to do something about this. We've got to tell this story in a more accurate and a more inclusive way. And so that's when I started collecting and exhibiting and writing and showing and telling and participating and representing through the media, as I work in the media now as a broadcaster, and I have for about almost 20 years, of telling the stories from a different perspective. I started doing halftime specials during Black History Month, and as I was growing and learning, of course I knew about Jack Johnson and his brave and his triumphs, and how he really changed America, and how he had this great fight on July 4th, 1910, and it's the biggest sports event in the history of our country today. And as also Arthur Ashe agreed, he's the most significant athlete in American history. So learning about Jack Johnson and all of his triumphs, I started to study, and he talked about this one fighter named Tom Molineaux. So now, who was Tom Molineaux? Why don't I know about him? And in this study, I found out that the first great athlete in American history was a black boxer named Tom Molineaux. I said, how could this possibly be, that being a sports person and being a person who studies and reads and knows about sports figures, I have never heard about the first great athlete in our country's history. So I started writing books, and this book is titled The Integration of Sports History. And I'll just read a little bit to you from my foreword before I share a little bit with you about Tom Molineaux and why I think he and others are very important. In this volume, I share stories that reveal the character of sports pioneers who've often been neglected, omitted, or silenced. Their history, legend, and legacy that laid the foundation of great American sports must be revered, remembered, and restored. These heroes must no longer be made invisible. Their great accomplishments, covered as though they were shameful or minor, must be exposed and recognized as a foundation for future generation of athletes. After all, it was not their decision to segregate the leagues, instill racism and discriminatory policies and unjust laws into our society. They protested against injustice and demonstrated athletic excellence that was second to none. When professional and collegiate sports were integrated, black athletes who participated were recognized for some of their accomplishments. However, black athletes who preceded the integrationists were dismissed, marginalized, or made insignificant. It was made to seem as if they never existed, while constant praise and acknowledgement was given to white athletes who played in the same era. Presently, black stars are reluctantly mentioned, and sometimes with resistance, during the annual celebration of Black History Month. Sports history has never been integrated. That responsibility now falls upon the shoulders of sports lovers of this generation. Sports has always been magical in its ability to break down barriers of race, language, culture, religion, and nationality. The same feat of breaking down educational, social, legal, and economic walls was accomplished with the leadership of Frederick Douglass Harriet Tubman, Thurgood Marshall, Walter White, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. Now, with a willing heart and an open mind, we will be led to understand and learn more about the lives of Bill Richmond, Tom Molyneux, Saul White, and other forgotten black athletes, and use this newfound inspiration to restore some of American heroes to their proper places. So our job of breaking down barriers and sharing the stories of these athletes will be a lot easier and a lot more fun. So I reflected back on the words of Carter G. Woodson, who said, "We have a wonderful history behind us that reads like a history of people in a heroic age. We're going back to that beautiful history, and it's going to inspire us to greater achievements." Now with this, I went back to Molyneux, to his story of a man who was enslaved and grew up in Virginia. And he grew up in a family of great fighters where his dad, Zachary, had never been defeated. And all of his uncles were great, called warlike figures. And it was a time when blacks were pitted against each other for the, sometimes for gambling, for the sport against other blacks on other plantations. And as Tom Molyneux was undefeated and wanted to be just like his dad, he grew in fame and in stature. And eventually it was apparently one big fight that his enslaver said, "I would bet possibly the entire plantation if you're able to win this fight. And if you win it, you would get your freedom." So Molyneux was able to get his freedom and won the fight. And there was laws across the country and in the state of Virginia that was, if you were freed or manumitted, you had so long where you had to leave the state of Virginia. It was unbelievable laws of suppression and oppression at that time. So Molyneux went to New York, where he stayed for about 5 years. And James Weldon Johnson, in his book Manhattan, said that at that time, that was the headquarters of Negro boxers. So this fighter from the South, who had defeated all challengers here, went to New York and for 5 years defeated all worthy challengers. And now all of a sudden, some of the sailors that were coming in and out of the ports were telling him, "Yes, you've defeated everyone here. There's nobody that can beat you. But the heavyweight championship of the world is in London." At that time, English had resurrected a sport that had started in ancient Africa centuries earlier, but it kind of died down in the period of the Roman empires with all of the, as they took it too far with all of the things in the Roman amphitheaters, etc. And it had resurrected in London, England. And if you were the champ of England, you were the heavyweight champion of the world. So with extraordinary courage that any athlete of the day would be tremendously proud of, this first great athlete in our country's history said, "Okay, I'm going to get on a boat and I'm going to go to England to be heavyweight champion of the world." So he had the audacity of a Muhammad Ali and the courage and the confidence of any great athletes that we have today. So as Molyneux made his way to England, he left at a time when Thomas Jefferson was still president of the United States. It was in 1809. And he fought his way up, and he actually ran across Bill Richmond, who was a guy that had left America, a black guy had left America during the Revolutionary War and had become a great fighter himself. So he actually trained Tom Molyneux. Molyneux became a great fighter and got all the way within 2 fights. It was determined that only the world champ was qualified to fight against this great fighter, Tom Molyneux. So on December 18th, 1810, which I celebrated this year with a very special ceremony where we had the 200-year anniversary of the first great fight by an American that was on the world stage. Tom Molyneux fought against Tom Cribb 200 years ago. I thought it was worthy of celebration and worthy of note, as much as we love sports, as important as sports is to America, that this 200-year anniversary should be commemorated. Was that the word we were looking for? Help us out, man. So I thought this had to be commemorated. So I did it the best way. I got an exhibit together, and I got some great athletes together, some Nolan Richardson, some Negro League players, and other people, and we got together, and we celebrated the 200-year anniversary of this great fight, of this great champion. America still, for some reason, refuses to really embrace and celebrate and recognize our heritage and our past. Something about controlling the pen and controlling history, you kind of control the present and the future. So I think it's very important that we share the stories of people like Molyneux, who was the fight. There has been many scholarly articles and written and studied about that fight, and I won't go into the details on it, but he was declared the loser by some ways that really seemed very unfair, particularly according to today's standards, that it was really stolen from him outright. He should have been declared the champion almost. That's universally kind of agreed that Molyneux should have been declared the champion, but was not. Also, there was another thing that I think that is very important in the contemporary analysis that we really have to include also. As we celebrate each year, very appropriately, the success and the importance of Jackie Robinson, his impact on sports, the entire country in Major League Baseball taking a day to recognize him is very appropriate and very special. The thing that I have a little problem with is that we totally ignore the couple of players that preceded Jackie Robinson, particularly Moses Fleetwood Walker, who in 1884 really integrated the white leagues at that time. And we kind of just had a gentleman's agreement, which was what happened after Moses Fleetwood Walker, that blacks would not be participated. So historically, they used to say in the modern era, but they just quit saying that now. They just say Jackie Robinson integrated that baseball, which I don't even call major league, because major must assume that it's minor, must assume that it's bigger, and the other must be smaller. So as he integrated the white leagues, they don't even acknowledge that Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was a tremendous athlete, he was a tremendous catcher, a tremendous runner. They had songs about him. He was such a great catcher. He also was a person that he was a scholar, had written one of the most scholarly books written by an athlete for 50 years or more. It was called Our Home Colony, where he espoused many of the philosophies of Marcus Garvey. This was in 1908 that he really talked about maybe we needed to go to Africa, various things, that we were kind of like a colony of America and we were not really free here in America. So he talked about complex issues along with sports. So he was a great scholar, he was a great athlete. Moses Fleetwood Walker should never be thrown away. We should never just say Jackie Robinson was the first player to integrate baseball, because he was not. So I think also that we, as Professor Early was saying, that as we acknowledge now in the media, when we make comparisons and analysis of today's athletes with previous athletes, as he mentioned Joe DiMaggio, we had one of the Dodgers who had a hitting streak of 30 games, and of course they compared him with the streak of Joe DiMaggio's in 1941, but never a mention was, well, but at that time that was only white guys, it was just the white league baseball. So I think that if we're going to be accurate, we have to be accurate. And I think we do a disservice to everyone when we just allow our heroes to stay in the back of the bus. So I think it's part of our objective and responsibility is to escort these great stars back to the front of the bus. And I really celebrate also, recently we had another special little ceremony for the unveiling of the stamp of Rube Foster. Rube Foster also was a great pitcher, maybe one of the greatest pitchers that ever pitched in professional baseball. He was a great manager, probably one of the greatest managers who ever managed in professional baseball as well, and a great organizer. He organized the Negro Leagues in the 1920s. So there's no comparison to him to anyone in any other culture. He's kind of on a league of his own. So as we compare and as we recognize these great athletes and coaches, I think we have to make that an inclusive analysis. I don't think we can just make them a special footnote during Black History Month. And as we talk about the Boston Red Sox of 1918, we have to talk about the Chicago American Giants if we're going to be educated, if we're going to be inclusive. And I think that I've found that people want to know about them. I don't think it's just the black people want to know. I find that white athletes want to know, and the white public wants to know about these great athletes, what they did, the context that they did it in. Sometimes it's an unfair comparison to not take into effect the context that they played in, the discrimination, the limitations, all of the things that they had to counteract, because that's a part of history too. And part of being a historian and a collector is to recognize the context that they that they played in. So sometimes you can't just look at straight numbers and say all of the great coaches were these coaches that won this many games when others were not allowed the opportunity or played in different circumstances, et cetera. So I think we need more analytical, more analysis, more scholarship on these areas, and I really salute the work that Pellom is doing, and I'm very happy and honored to be a part of your discussion today. So thank you very much.
Okay, our next panelist and our final panelist is the Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at Emory University, and is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of History and African American Studies. Dr. Earl Lewis holds degrees in history and psychology, is the author and co-editor of several books, 7 books actually, among them In Their Own Interests, Race, Class, and Power in 20th Century Norfolk, and the award-winning To Make Our World Anew, A History of African Americans. Between 1997 and 2000, he co-edited the 11-volume The Young Oxford History of African Americans. Dr. Lewis co-authored the widely acclaimed Love on Trial, An American Scandal in Black and White, published in 2001 by Norton. His most recent books are The African American Urban Experience, Perspectives from the Colonial Period to the Present, co-edited and published with Palgrave, and co-written a book entitled Defending Diversity, Affirmative Action at the University of Michigan, published by the University of Michigan Press. Let me add that the Provost has been a great supporter of this effort to develop MARBL's new focus on African Americans in sports. And I think when we first met with him, he was really excited about the possibility of bringing this history to light here at Emory, here in Atlanta. Provost Lewis.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure. And according to Randall, and using the baseball metaphor, I guess I'm hitting cleanup. Here, and so part of that means that I'm actually in between you and conversation and discussion. So let me make 2 or 3 general comments and really speak specifically both to the themes that Mike and Gerald highlighted in their talks, and then the larger effort that Pellom noted. One of the things I think is very, very important for us all to consider is the fact that sometimes history is there in plain sight, but not visible. And so where Mike's poems sort of highlight the ways in which there are stories right before us. And it only takes us to pause long enough to actually understand their place and significance. It becomes a job then of all of us to own that responsibility in a way. Institutions like Emory then have a special role because we can do something and some things that others can't, which is to make sure that we archive and preserve forever those documents and those ways of knowing that others then can come back and actually try to piece together a story. And so the first piece here is then about the role of actually identifying what deserves to be preserved. Not everything that I have seen in people's closets or basements or in churches really should be preserved forever. So there's some order to all of this, where we actually try to wrestle with how important is it? And why do we want to actually claim part of the 10th floor or the 11th floor or wherever in MARBL here in the Woodruff Library to hold on to this forever? That becomes a role of not only then uncovering those things that are in plain sight, but also asking the question I think Gerald was wrestling with. The notion of race in American life, the intersection between African Americans and sport, is really parallels the larger story about America's deep engagement with race. It is that deep engagement, and I use those words carefully, and that requires us then to try to figure out how do we make sure that this generation and subsequent generations then have the tools to try to analyze the bits and pieces that we've begun to sort of put on the table here. How do we understand what the story of inclusion? Because in the communities I grew up in Virginia in the 1950s and the 1960s, There was never any assumption that there were some people who knew how to compete and compete well on the baseball fields, on the basketball courts, and then on the football fields. But they also could do it on the tennis courts and in swimming pools and on the golf courses. So there were sports that were sort of part of the larger commodification of America that gets a lot of attention and is talked about because that feeds, in my view, the relationship between sports and capital. And that we talk about certain things because they sell. They end up on jerseys. They end up on other products that we can distribute. I still remember the day in 1991, and I was in Dubrovnik, looking out at this little plaza of these kids playing basketball, all wearing LA Lakers t-shirts. And I kept thinking, I'm looking for Vlade Divac's name on the back of one of them. And it wasn't Vlade they were selling in Dubrovnik just before Yugoslavia came apart. And while I was there, Yugoslavia voted to become something other than the Yugoslavia we knew in 1991. And I remember sitting there looking at this courtyard and these kids, and I'm going, okay, what is this about? And then I went to a hotel in Belgrade later on where they were selling other parts of the commodity industry. In this case, other images of America. It was the early days of rap and the early days of MTV. And the most fascinating conversation of a European interlocutor trying to explain malt liquor to Eastern Europe. And the ways in which then this sort of urban, intensely sort of identified and commodified black culture and black cultural experience, and then was transported across the Atlantic. And I realized there was a juxtaposition of basketball being sold in one spot and these other images being sold in the other. And you realize the deep engagement with race is not a singular story, but it's a multiple and integrated story about the ways in which we have projected our broader image onto the world. And so then the story then of making sure that we deal with, and I think it was Gerald's point about the power dynamics, that ultimately, that when we're talking about, in my view, the story of sports and race in American history, is also a story about power. There weren't, and Gerald will remember the number of cities, but I can remember that when Jack Johnson won that fight, there were race riots all over the United States. And you're trying to figure out, okay, why did people go to the streets and riot over Jack Johnson's defeat? Tommy Burns had the temerity to actually believe that he could beat Jack Johnson because of the larger narrative about race and power. He believed, although he was smaller in stature and older in age, that he had the power to beat Jack Johnson, and he lost. And the whole equation upon which the edifice of segregation rested was called into question. And you realize that the symbolic gesture of a ring and rope is sort of symbolizing then the boundaries of the world, and that you're in there squaring off within that sort of squared space, playing by quote unquote established rules, and you win. This is a story not then just about these two men who were boxing. It really is the American story about his sort of deep engagement with race. And so when we come back then to a place like MARBL and our role here, it is our ability then to think about all of those stories down to so the early part from 1800 down to the most recent stories about Michael Vick or anyone else we want to put on the table to engage. And there, three other things I think come to the fore. One is that we also need to make sure that we're collecting materials that allow us to deal with African Americans as complex human beings. What I don't want is a singular dimensional story. And hopefully the documents that we actually are able to preserve reflect that complexity. As a native Virginian, and in my community where I grew up in Tidewater, which is sort of Newport News is sort of part of that larger world, we always would say, friends of mine would go, Michael knew better, in a certain kind of way, and he even knew more because his friends, and you sort of figure out who your friends are, and you realize there are certain things you shouldn't be doing. But that actually simplifies the story, because what it does is deal with the complexities of the moment and all the other pieces that actually explain how you end up in this situation in the first place. And why isn't there some little button in the back of your head going off, or alarm going off saying, you know, I make more money from commercials and from the advertising than I ever will do throwing a football for the Atlanta Falcons. And it's that part that I'm going to give up. Those are the pieces that reflect the complexities. But I have always argued African American peoples have always been complex. And the linear story only begins to tell part of the story. And that's sort of part of the challenge for us, is to make sure that we are collecting in such a way that we can deal with those deep dimensions. And the second part of this is also, we should also invite and collect and assume that we will always be surprised. And this is the piece, and as Randall knows, and Randall and I joke, because Randall has been known to call the dumpster divers to actually sort of figure out what people are throwing away and why they're throwing them away, and realize that in some of those are the treasures where we are actually surprised by what others have decided aren't important, that we actually have concluded along the way actually have great importance, because they are linked to then a series of other kinds of possibilities. And the third part is then, and the last part is that as we collect in the 20th century, to remember we're in the 21st century. And that a lot of what we collect in the 20th century were the papers and the memoirs and the other documents. But in the 21st century, we have multiple media. And the ways in which we think about, okay, whose tweet, and then ends up getting a sort of ways in which people respond. Because what we know is that folks not only respond, I mean, the polls go up with athletes in terms of when they're winning and when they're losing and all, but we also know people follow their tweets. And then there are these ways in which we need to begin to make sure that as we collect for a 21st century environment and not just for a 20th century one. And that we are sort of setting up the archives in such a way to accommodate things that may have, I mean, if you think of technology having a life cycle every 18 months. And so by the time we get it, how many generations later? And so we have to actually ask the question, if we collect it, can we actually retrieve it? And how do we retrieve it? But more than that, how do we retrieve it, preserve it, and then make it possible for others to use it? I mean, those are the kinds of questions I think we need to help, because it's then going back to the young folks who will be reading the books and other documents produced by Mike and Gerald and Pellom, and if I ever get back to it again, or being able to write the things I will write. But it's also the fact that now we can actually stream the video and the audio along with what they're going to read, and you get people to actually engage in a different kind of way of learning, and where the reader becomes the author at the same time, because they're engaging in what's known. And so I welcome both this opportunity for Emory University, and signal the responsibility that goes with it. Each time, and it's the folks in the library know, every time they tell me they're going to bring another collection in, I take a deep breath, because I realize someone has to pay for it too. And that has, and Randall has been real good. He's gotten me to say yes more often than not. And so he's very effective here, but it makes me also making sure that we're asking the questions about the future. And so I share both in your sense of deep obligation and the complexities of the narratives, plural, that have been created, and then the challenges for us as we go forward to make sure that we are the proper stewards that we seek to be when we say that we're going to archive these important materials. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so now is the time for Q&A. We have a microphone in the back. If you raise your hand, Mashadi, no, she has it right back there. If you raise your hand, Mashadi will come through and allow you to ask your question.
First of all, thank you all for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I want to go back to a point that Dr. Early made in the beginning of his presentation about commodification of athletics and also the commodification specifically of black athletes. And I wanted to think about that within a kind of intra-racial construct and see if you all might comment about that, both in terms of just your general thoughts as well as within the context of collecting. I'm thinking kind of in two kind of historical eras, if you will. One, I'm thinking about kind of the early creation kind of commerce around the personas of black athletes as was affected by those athletes themselves. And I was thinking just recently of a photograph, for example, that I have of an advertisement for Joe Louis Punch, and the ways in which that was, those advertisements appear, for example, in the Afro-American newspaper and such. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then in a more modern context, or more contemporary context, thinking about the beginning, I'm imagining, this is in my area, but I'm thinking of mid to late 90s, the creation of this kind of semi-professional leagues of, for example, basketball, in which, you know, rappers and drug dealers and the others of wealth in black communities have begun to purchase, for all intents and purposes, their own leagues, and the commodification of black athleticism within that context, and what that means within community, and whether there might be any possibilities for collecting around that kind of athleticism.
So, 3 panelists, who will go first? Lead off batter.
Okay. All right, very interesting perspectives on that. And there are a lot of, kind of to the last point, about a lot of new leagues and some that, and ones, and there are a variety of different entertainment as well as competitive leagues. And you're right, there are a lot of people getting involved, getting interested, betting on, doing a variety of things from all ages. And this sports has always been such a big part of our communities and our passions, and so I think in some ways it's kind of filling a void that when we had these leagues to leave, which was a dramatic impact on our economies and our cultures, when you had the Negro leagues and black basketball teams as well. And so I think a lot of this localization and keep it going and keep it a community, like the Rutgers tournament up in New York where they got the music, and it's kind of a cultural thing as well. So I think it can be collected. You know, as you keep expanding, I think you can collect. There's a very good collectible book called Soul of the Game, where they talk a lot about the athletes that are not in the NBA, the street legends, the guys who have kind of made their fame or made at least their notoriety through playing on the streets and in those kind of environments. So yeah, I think there's books to be written, things to be collected, even though it's not so much documentation, but now with the new ways of filming and all of that. So yeah, I think there are new horizons there to answer that part of your question. Thank you.
The other part of your question about, for instance, the Joe Louis Punch and everything. Black athletes, well, at the time, you know, Joe Louis didn't have anything to do with the manufacturing of it. He just kind of sold his name. Lots of athletes did that, black and white. It was very common for athletes, as today, as 50, 80 years ago, to try to find, if you became a star athlete, to try to find ways to cash in on your name to make money. And for instance, back during the days of Jack Johnson, one of the things that boxers did, and even other noted black athletes, were to go on stage and perform on stage, because it's a heck of a lot easier to have a little act on stage than to go out and box. And so lots of people did that. It wasn't just Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey. That white athletes did it as well, and John L. Sullivan did it, and they would have stage shows and things like that to try to make more money, because even as far back as over 100 years ago, a star athlete understood himself, well, mostly it was him then, as opposed to women, as a kind of commodity. They understood their name meant something, that they understood that if they appeared somewhere, they could draw a lot of people, and so they wanted to take advantage of that. It's of course gotten, black athletes insofar as really getting into the endorsement game, it took a while because most of the time they were limited to just endorsing products that would be for a black audience. So when Willie Mays or people like that at first with Alaga syrup, for instance, that was a product that was mostly sold to African Americans, and so Willie Mays would be on a poster for it or something like that, or he would appear in Ebony magazine for Chesterfield cigarettes or something like. Because there was a time when athletes, in fact, endorsed tobacco products too. They don't do that now, but they used to do that. And he would be in Ebony magazine. It took a while. You can read, for instance, like Bob Gibson's autobiography the first one he did back in the late 60s or something like that, where he complained that he was unable to get the kind of endorsements despite the fact that he had, been such a stellar player and had been dominant in the World Series and so forth, that he couldn't get the same kind of endorsements that some of the white players, Carl Yastrzemski, or some of the other white players were able to get. It took time for that to break. I would say probably you started seeing some real movement along those lines, probably starting in the 80s, with black athletes being able to do more endorsing. Probably the biggest single figure I think who really dramatically changed that would be Michael Jordan. I mean, Michael Jordan was like, Michael Jordan is he's not just a book, he would be a whole series of books. It's so far as his impact commercial impact on sports go. I mean, he's a figure unto himself. And I would say he's really the key figure who really was able to exploit himself as a commodity and be this huge crossover figure in a way that no other black athlete before him was that kind of a crossover figure in the market.
The only thing I would echo on it is that one of the opportunities, particularly in the period from the 1930s until the 1960s, is actually to peer behind the screen of segregation and realize that in that era was actually a larger story about black entrepreneurial zeal and the ways in which businesses actually get created, including in the world of sport. And that those businesses are not only in sports, however, because there's also then a hotel business that actually gets connected as people move from city to city, and there becomes a network. And there are eating establishments that also become part of that network. And then there are entertaining establishments that become part of that network. And so this period, we study one piece of it. You actually have a larger story about the rise of and the continuation of and the competition for business aspects as well in the African American community, where you can start that through a story by looking at who owned which teams and how, but also then how that sort of multiplied into other areas. And I said 1930s to the 1960s because actually things do change after with desegregation. And there's this interesting way about what happens to a racial business market in the United States, particularly in the South, after desegregation.
I would add to that, too, that we forgot about black jockeys in the 19th century. They themselves may not have been able to have endorsements, but prior to the Civil War, their owners would have portraits painted of them and the horses. So an Edward Troy, who was painting in the 1830s through the 1870s, is producing these wonderful images of the horses with black groomers, trainers, and jockeys. And so this is the commodification of the most successful jockeys and groomers along with the horses. So that's another way in which to sell black athleticism is something that's significant. Next question.
Thank you. My question is around kind of the nature of modern media and modern sports coverage, as opposed to maybe just even 20 years ago. Growing up, I mean, even in the 80s, you really didn't see out-of-market players that often unless they were playing your team. Now, I grew up in New York, so I had multiple teams where you would see multiple opponents. However, prior to that, you really only knew your team and your players and occasionally that rival. But today's, consumption of sports, we seem to know about every team, every player. We're in Atlanta, we know about San Francisco Giants, we know about, LA Clippers, we know about, it doesn't really matter where they are, we still know about them. And I wonder if you could speak to kind of, in comparison to historically, to what degree did either in Negro leagues or in major leagues or in other sports, did people know about the lives of athletes outside of their particular team? So if you were in Birmingham, did you know about Kansas City Grays or something like that? Oh, Monarchs, excuse me. Did you know about that? To what extent? Thank you.
Well, we did a lot. I think a lot has been lost from past eras, but they knew in their era. Arthur Ashe, who wrote a great book, a three-part book about black athletes, he said that the black athletes have been the most accomplished figures in the African American subculture. They were vastly better known in their times than people such as Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, or Marcus Garvey. They inspired idolatry bordering on deification, and thousands more wanted to follow. He compared Joe Gans, who was a lightweight champ during the 1912 and early 1900s, and said he was possibly more popular than Booker T. Washington. So I think we did know who those stars were at that time, but historically they kind of get swept under the rug and we kind of forget about them. But I think they were huge stars in their time period.
I would even, there are two things I want to say. So Frederick Douglass actually endorses Peter Jackson during the late 19th century as he's doing wonderful things for the race because he's a champion boxer. Here's someone who was the Australian and English champion who was not allowed to fight for the American championship because Sullivan was not going to fight a black man. And in the 20th century, you have the Negro Leagues players that are barnstorming around the Midwest. So they're bringing the news to each town they visit. On top of that, you have the Pullman porters that are getting off at different stops. Maybe they're giving the newspaper from Kansas City in someplace in Omaha or Birmingham. So the news is traveling on these railroad lines and also with these buses with these players traveling throughout the Midwest. So they know each other. And they, and it's Mr. O'Neill, Buck O'Neill always talked about, people say, you're bringing the news. And I think Gerald Early can speak to this with the whole baseball phenomenon. Ken Burns that was one of the appealing things that he brought to that whole series was that kind of easygoing, familiar sense of, you could know this guy. And it was that kind of conversational style that really appealed to people to want to know more about this black baseball league. Yes.
Gerald, another reason Bob Gibson didn't get endorsements is he scared white people, beginning with white batters. But, there's a terrible racial injustice that I hope will be addressed in the coming years, and that's the spectacle of white college coaches making millions of dollars off the sweat and labor of predominantly black athletes who get suspended if they sell their jersey for $1,000. Most of these kids are poor. The few who get pro contracts, I think it's touching. The first thing they do when they become instant millionaires, they buy their mother a house. But most of them don't get that far. But what an incredible disconnect between this caste system of fabulously well-compensated coaches who are supposedly geniuses thanks to the labor of their athletes who get nothing. And I think it's an injustice that has to be addressed. And one of the greatest villains in the piece, as always, I think is the NCAA.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think you're right on point. It's always been a challenge of how do you organize around that to combat that power. And you're talking about young collegiate kids who don't really have anybody to really speak for them. So I would agree because Herb White also in the audience who played with the Hawks before I did and also doing a great documentary on black athletes in the Atlanta area. I might mention he's been really lobbying hard to get funding and support of that, and I wanted to acknowledge his great work and hope that any way we can help him, we should continue. But also speaks on that behalf of the athletes who have nobody to turn to when the same $20 or whatever we got back when we played, Herb, is about all the athletes get now, despite the fact that it's a $1 billion industry now. The pot is so much larger, but the athletes get just very little of it. I don't know if Herb has anything he wants to add to that. Herb, you want to add anything to that? Herb White?
Well, I agree with the gentleman who raised the issue. Certainly something that needs to be addressed. There's huge concerns, of course, about the amateurism for college athletics. If you start paying the athletes, and do you pay an athlete based on what he brings to the school? If it's a football player and he's helping to bring in millions of dollars, or it could be a young woman who's playing lacrosse, what do you pay her? So there's a lot of thorny issues when you start getting into paying people. But yes, I agree that something I think needs to be done to set up maybe something for these kids when they get out of school. So instead of maybe receiving a lot of funding or something, they can receive something after they get out of school that can help continue their education beyond 2 or 3 or 4 years or whatever they do in school, and other things to help them after they get out of school, beyond what they did, because what they did for the school goes on for a long time after they leave. Yes. If you've got a national championship banner hanging there up on the, people recognize you bring so much to the school that goes on for years, and then you're shuffled off and gone. So yeah, I think that does need to be addressed, and I appreciate the kind words about the documentary.
Can you say more about that, Herb?
You have a few minutes now?
I think we can fit you in.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Mike did mention I work at Georgia Public Broadcasting. I've been there for going on about 20 years. I grew up 10 minutes from here over in Decatur, Georgia, just across Scott Boulevard, and I'm just going to give you a quick 2-minute my history, and that'll tell you a little bit about the documentary I'm working on. Venetian Swimming Pool, some of you may know about it. It's right there on Scott Boulevard in Decatur. It used to be a very private club back in the segregated 60s. It was all white people, but there was a young guy that worked there in the locker room, a young black guy, and George, and I got to be friends with him. Well, he would see us shooting basketballs out there in the beside the locker room there, and he said, "Hey man, you really want to learn how to play basketball, you need to come over and play some at Ebster Gym." And I knew that Ebster was the black recreation center in Decatur. Of course, back then in the early 60s, there was a white recreation center and a black recreation center. So one night, my friend Bob Morley and myself, I think we were in the 9th grade, we decided to go to Ebster and play basketball. So we did, and that was quite a story in itself. It was kind of reverse integration. Here's 2 white guys show up at the Ebster Recreation Center. But the story is, over the years, I got to know some guys, some black guys, and they became good friends of mine. And through them, I became a very good basketball player. I was the only white guy, and the other guy left town. So I was playing at Ebster Recreation Center, and I would play with these guys all summer, and then I would go back and play in the white high school league, and it was like going to the B team. So by my senior year in high school, I was recognized by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as the #1 player in the state. Well, I always felt a little strange about that because I knew there were guys I played against all summer that were as good as me, but those guys didn't get recognized. So I went on and played in college at Georgia and with the Atlanta Hawks, and I always wanted to do something to recognize those guys that helped me out, and I started writing just a story. I thought it might be a book or something over the years. And then a few years ago, the AJC wrote some articles, a couple of guys wrote some articles about the GIA, which was the Georgia Interscholastic Association, which was actually the African American High School League in Georgia prior to integration. Of course, you had the Georgia High School Association, which was all the white schools competed against each other, and then you had the Georgia Interscholastic Association, which was the group of all the black schools. And of course, there was no play between the schools. So anyhow, once I saw those articles and I started talking about the great athletes that played in that league, I said, well, I wanted to recognize the guys that helped me, but why don't I recognize all those folks? So I started working on this documentary, and it's been a long haul for 4, 5, 6 years now, trying to raise the money. And but it's the story of the African American sports legacy in Georgia prior to integration. And you had people like Walt Frazier, John Blue Moon Odom, Rayfield Wright, Wyoming Attias, Edith McGuire, Olympic athletes, the coaches, unbelievable amount of coaches and teams that did great things that people don't know anything about. It's unbelievable. And one of the coaches at the time said it was like we were ghosts. And so I kind of paraphrased that. And the title of the documentary is As If We Were Ghosts. And we're working on it now. And I want to talk to Emory University a little more about it because I know we have some things that you may want to look at. We found some interesting documents, and maybe we can work with some of your students to help us doing research on the project. But we're going on with this, and if you want to see a short video trailer, about a 4-minute video trailer, you can go to gpb.org. That's our station, Georgia Public Broadcasting, gpb.org/ghosts. And there's a 4-minute video trailer there narrated by Andrew Young, who works in our building some, and when I went up to him and told him about the project, he said, Herb, I was a track athlete in high school, and the same thing happened to me, so anything I can do to help you. So thanks for the time. Thanks for letting me get up and talk about it, and we'd love to have some folks give us a call about that.
Thank you. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. One right there, one right here.
Thank you. I guess one reason I have a lot of passion about sports, particularly dealing with African Americans, or just sports in general, is it so reflects what's going on in the history of the United States. I think sports is a good reflection of racial tensions and everything. It's really dramatic, like a big soap opera. But one thing I will always, these images are struck in my mind. I remember that, because for a while, if you're black, you were not going to be a quarterback. And I know you had like Randall Cunningham and you had Warren Moon, but they were more like aberrations. It wasn't like African Americans were accepted as quarterbacks. And then I remember for Pittsburgh Steelers, Cordell Stewart came in, but it was Slash. You remember? Okay. Yeah. No, sorry. Maybe this was before time, sorry. But it was like, Slash. And to me, immediately what I thought of is how for a long time, for example, in baseball, for African Americans, if they wanted to be a manager, you had to be like player/manager. And I'm looking at this at TV, and I felt like, am I the only one that's getting this? Like, it's still like that repetition of that same, those same, how do you say it, like processes going on. And the same thing with, I remember Tony Dungy, and it's bad when even white commentators are sitting on television. I'll never forget, it was a commentator, and he was saying, Tony Dungy was still with the Minnesota Vikings, and everyone said he was great and wonderful, and it was completely racist, so this man had never been given the opportunity to be a head coach. And so now, we have lots of black coaches, but then the fact is lots of them have always come under Tony Dungy. It's not like the league is so, there's still, the way they're getting into the league is by this one head coach. And so my point is, what I would ask you to comment on is, I know we forget a lot of our past, like way back history, but you still sort of see these same cycles and same events still occurring, I think, today, and then it's like 5 years later, we act like it didn't happen. And I sort of feel like, it's sort of like, you could just be smashing ants. It's things that I feel so obviously racist, but we sort of act like, okay, life's great, we have, Tomlin for the Pittsburgh Steelers, no problems. And I'm like, do you not remember? I grew up knowing as if for a fact, if you were black, you were not going to be a quarterback. And we're acting like, it could have been 200 years ago. Okay, I'll calm down.
Okay. We love that passion.
There's a footballer, Pellom.
Well, my comments as it relates to black quarterbacks, I think that of course, it's been one of those difficult positions to always figure out because you're not smart enough, is what they're saying, because the quarterback is the most important position on the football field. But we know that that's not true. We know of a Doug Williams who won a Super Bowl. We know of a Joe Gilliam, right, whose brother Frank Gilliam actually was part of the Steubenville Three. They came out of Ohio in the 1960s or late 50s that were part of the first 3 black athletes recruited by a major college football team at University of Iowa. So the ability is there, but going back to what Provost Lewis talked about, where the racial kind of realities and stereotypes persist, it's hard to break through because still the expectation is that these black men who are athletic, and it's a God-given talent because we don't see them practice, as Dr. Early alluded to, they don't think because what's natural is the athletic ability. And so, and you're correct in saying that, we kind of forget about that because everything is good right now, where you have a Michael Vick who is very athletic, but you also have a Donovan McNabb who's very cerebral. And so these are counters that are in the public eye that really don't remind you of the past because you have these foils in a way, I guess, that are constantly present. But still, I think your observation, you're not crazy because people will forget about the past because this is what we're dealing with. And we have to, when we have an opportunity, reiterate the past as it presents itself because it does cycle itself back to the present.
And one thing, too, I'd like for a gentleman to say a few words, quick words, if he would. I think Spike Lee's done a good job in starting a sports journalism program over at Morehouse so that you have voices from black reporters and others to to say and to, here's a smart player, and to kind of tell a different side of the story. And so we have the head of that program is here today. Would you want to just say a couple of just quick words for us? Ron Thomas, please.
Thank you. My name's Ron Thomas.
There go Machadi.
And I've known Mike for years and years. I used to cover college basketball when he's played for Southern Illinois. And I've invited Mike, and he's done a couple programs at Morehouse. We call it the Journalism and Sports Program. So it's a general journalism program, but one of the primary missions is to develop more students into black sports reporters. Because of all the newspaper sports reporters in the country, only 6% are black. And a couple of my students are here, so I'm really glad to see them. It's perfect timing that it was very nice for you to introduce me, but I wanted to make another comment about your comment, which is, there's a visual way of looking at this whole question of lack of black quarterbacks and lack of blacks, the long time it took for blacks to get these cerebral positions in football. If you look at the football field, the whole lineup, offense versus defense, look at it as if it was a series of concentric circles. And if you think of where did blacks first get a chance to play, it was on the outer edges of that circle. So it would be your running backs, your wide receivers, and your cornerbacks. And so that's the very outside. And then if you just think at the very center of this, center of the line of scrimmage where the ball is hiked, think of that as the brain of the football field. So then the next level was then you started to get some fullbacks, and you started to get some maybe offensive tackles, and you started to get some defensive linemen, and the outside linebacker. But the last group for the last place positions for there to be blacks were quarterbacks, but even probably at some point there probably were fewer offensive centers. And then another one was middle linebacker. You remember Willie Lanier is one of the first middle linebackers. So those are the core thinking positions in football: middle linebacker, center, and quarterback. And those were all the positions that were last for blacks to get integrated into. So to me, it's just fascinating that it just speaks to the fact that our intellectual ability in sports still is diminished. And even if it's not diminished now, it took way too long for it to be recognized.
Okay, we have one more question on this side of the room.
If you accept the notion that drugs are a bad thing in the locker room for pro sports, illicit and performance-enhancing drugs, and I say that because there may be some that say, who cares if Barry Bonds uses steroids? I was taken aback a little bit about the amount of effort from the judicial system that got involved in Barry Bonds, and even at the congressional level panels. So I'm curious what you guys think about the role of Congress in getting involved in regulating drugs in sports. Don't think you have better things to do?
Yeah, I do think Congress does have better things to do, and I was.
At least we hope.
Yeah, yes. At least we hope they certainly, I believe, do have better things to do, and I was a bit surprised by their intervention into this area. I believe that it's debated among some people about how much of an effect performance-enhancing drugs actually have. That's been kind of debated, and so there's some people who will tell you that the effect is not as big as some people would suggest. That's one issue. The other issue, which I think is probably more germane, has always been if these athletes do this, would it affect young athletes, kids, and things like that into taking these drugs? And that would be certainly a great concern about having young kids and so forth taking the drugs. But I don't see where any kind of federal intervention in this really makes a difference. I think the most effective way that it would probably be policed if they're going to get these drugs out of sport would be for the sports themselves to police what they're doing. And I believe that that is very, you know, that's quite possible, and I think it should, and it can be done. Beyond that, it's really nothing more I have to say about it. I think it's no longer such a big issue in baseball. It's interesting that when Congress focused on it, they mostly focused on the big publicity was with baseball players. It was very interesting that there was not very much focus on athletes from any other sport. It was just baseball, although we know in track and field with Marion Jones, and we know about, you know, we know about in other sports. So it was interesting that it was only a focus in baseball, which may have something to say about the status of baseball in American life, or, you know, whatever. But it's interesting that it was just focused on baseball. But beyond that, I do think that there are other issues of concern. If we're interested in the athlete's abuse of his or her body, there are other issues of concern other than just performance-enhancing drugs, because there are other ways that athletes abuse their bodies. That if the public, if this is a compelling interest of the government to safeguard athletes, there are other areas of interest other than just performance-enhancing drugs. I do not see that it's a compelling interest of the government to protect athletes. I'd see that there would be enough other people around them who should be exercising that protection. I don't see where the government has a compelling interest in it.
I would even add that in some ways the 24-hour news cycle creates its own demands for maintaining a story. And that if you know that there are enough networks that actually need to have a story that's going to bring viewers back, and there are some that have a sort of sticky quality to them. And so the same people who read the polls that Gerald was sort of referring to earlier, I would dare say if someone would spend a little time, my guess is there are quite a few congressional offices where they too were reading the polls. Yeah. And to actually have your congressperson on certain issues out front would gain you advantages with your constituents. And so that may sound cynical, but it's politics. And so you realize that the day you're elected, you're running again. And you want to make sure that you stay in the news and that you are sort of at certain parts of the news cycle, that your name is out front. And so if you go back and plot it and figure out when these occurred, what time of the news cycle, what part of the year, when, it'd be interesting to see if there's any direct correlation between the attempt to actually keep some stories alive. And then you layer on that the more complicated story, both about baseball and about race. And then you end up with a story where no matter how many times you cut the legs out, it comes back in a new way. And I'm not sure that that story has helped to produce any additional jobs in the U.S., has helped to address anything about health care or any of the other things that are important to the body politic writ large. And so in the scheme of things, historians will judge this a minor story, but a minor story that attaches itself to an old narrative.
Okay. We have 2 minutes. Yes.
We've moved into the media bashing phase of this thing. I say it affectionately. I appreciate that the media has not been particularly effective on there, but I think particularly since Ron has sports journalism students here, we wouldn't be here had it not been for the black press and the pressure that they put on Branch Rickey, Chess Washington for the Pittsburgh Courier, most importantly Sam Lacey for the Baltimore Afro-American, and a whole raft of others. And I think it's just worth a moment of paying tribute to the work that they did for years, because they kept the pressure on the owners, and particularly on Branch Rickey, who was predisposed, I think, to do it anyway, but they emboldened him, I felt certain. So.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the black press played a very important role in that. And the black press is also, back to an earlier comment, question someone had, they were very important in spreading the news about these athletes and actually making a kind of national black community before you had 24-hour sports on 50 different channels. So the black press really doesn't get the kind of recognition that it deserves for what it has done to serve the black community.
Last one, yes.
Keon Grissom, student of Ron Thomas from Morehouse Journalism. I remember Mr. Early talking about the 6 most hated players, and just talking about listening to that list. All I could think about was like just the negative off court and off field things that they have done, and it makes me think about my generation coming out of the technology age, and we always, us young students always look at tweets, and we always look for the negative aspects and think about. I remember Ocho Cinco and Terrell Owens, as soon as the season was coming out, and they were like, oh man, what are they gonna do together? They're gonna be a crime duo team. And just always hearing about what they do off court and off field and stuff like that. I just wanna know, do y'all think it's ever gonna just go back to just on court decorum, and when people are just gonna start caring about stats and start caring about, because people could tell me, people from Virginia can always tell me what Michael Vick does off field, but can't tell me that he did 21 passing touchdowns and 9 rushing touchdowns recent season.
In some ways, part of it is that there are, if you think of Ocho Cinco, and I mean, there's a range of players, let me say that, and it's hard to collapse them into any one group. In the age of, and Hank, not even bashing the media, sort of pointing out, in the age when you really have a product and you need to have content for a long period of time. And so, I mean, one may ask the question, well, what's the craze with reality shows now? And so you end up finding that on every network channel and in a good number of the cable channels, there are network shows. If you have an athlete hosting his or her own network show, then what's the incentive to make it more outrageous so that you're trying to capture the viewer and the audience and so that you get renewed? And so I'm not sure that when Ocho Cinco had his show on last year, that if it was just showing him sitting at his dining room table session after session, anyone would have turned in. He knew it, so he ends up on the beach with a whole range of other folks and engaging in other activity. I mean, so it's this part of what, for some, what they do on the field indeed is obscured, but they're part of, I mean, they're smart enough to understand something about how the marketplace works. And so you actually end up separating those who are themselves working within the marketplace, one could say manipulating, certainly making use of in the parameters within it, versus those who actually have engaged in something that we may think of as a transgression. And in a long scheme of things, it is one time where they actually did something like most humans that they wish didn't end up in the newspaper, but because they're high profile, it does. I mean, those are sort of different categories of individuals as I sort of think about the constellation of professional athletes in the United States and the range of things that happen. And then, as some folks have known, and if you're also prominent enough that there are celebrity hounds following you, because they're going to make money making sure that they got your picture in a compromised situation. You have a whole nother dynamic. So it's not just the individuals, but you have another set of players who themselves are paid to watch you mess up. And then they get to sell that again in a different way. And so you asked a very complicated question because you got a spectrum of individuals engaged in sometimes things they know they're doing it because it also knows, like in the old days, you do certain things that are outrageous enough to make sure people come back and watch the next time around. And it's the trailers that follow. And the reality TV shows have sort of become an example of a whole market of activity.
Yeah, and I'll have to agree with him. I was working with CNN when we started, at that time, CNN SI, and they tried to have 24-hour sports, and we used to always say we got to feed the monster. So we're just looking for stories to keep feeding it. Eventually, they got rid of the SI network, but it is a constant demand to keep those stories coming. So I don't think we can put the genie back in the bottle anytime soon.
I don't think so. Star athletes are celebrities, and people are fascinated by them, and people want to know. People are fascinated wanting to know about what they do off the field. And I mean, I kind of agree with you that I think that what an athlete does on the field should be the most important thing, but for many people it's not. And I think I agree with my colleagues that I don't think it's going to change anytime soon because people, number one, people want that. I mean, they want those kind of stories. They want to hear that. And two, there's this huge monster that has to be fed because it's just so much, there are all kinds of sports publications and sports media out there, and it has to be fed.
Okay, well, I
Now
want to
we
say,
have
first of all,
The last question?
okay, Chris,
The very last question?
Professor Lowe.
the last question, okay. We have to save that kind of conversation for our kind of mixing area right now. I want to first of all say thank you for everyone coming out this afternoon. This has been very enjoyable. And again, once again, our panelists, I want to thank them for making the trip to come. And for some of you, it was around the corner, I know. But for all of you, again, we appreciate your support for MARBL and for what we're doing at Emory. Thank you. Okay.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.